All right. So 2 videos in one day, man. Hobby's crazy and not doing his homework. But I'm gonna try to keep this video short. I'm gonna try not to keep this video too long. But I had a wonderful conversation with Daniel Zuruba and Matthew. Um, I forgot his last name, but yeah, I had a wonderful conversation, and I really appreciate it. And this problem of lack kind of got raised again, and it's funny because like I've always been like somewhat critical of lack and like how we situate this. But one of the things that are kind of like always presented as like an obvious thing is like so we all have lack, right? We are beings that are born. I have needs. I need hunger, sex, and all these things, right? Um, but what's problematic, and Derrida actually makes a really interesting argument with the problem of origin, and this is the area that I think would be kind of interesting to play with and think through as a kind of experiment. And I know I'm kind of being spicy here by kind of like approaching lack this way. But what I'm going to fundamentally say is like the origin of lack is somewhat impossible. Um, and this is how I would situate it. So Derrida talks about the problem of origin. And of course, I read this through uh, Judith Butler, where she tries to describe like how Derrida talks about like you can't really return to the origin. And this is something similar to like what I'm going to say is like you really can't return to like the origin of lack. So for example, if I say that I'm hungry, right? Uh, I am not typically thinking about the location of that lack, but if I were to say, okay, so you're hungry, right? You're lacking food, okay? But where is that lack? Where is that lack? And you might say something like, you know, lack is, in my stomach, right? I'm hungry. My stomach is growling, and that's an indicator, a signification of the fact that I lack food, right? My stomach is growling, right? And this is how somebody might justify that there's an origin to lack, right? That my stomach is growling, so I need food, and therefore I lack food, and I'm going to eat food, right? The problem with that understanding of the locality of lack is the fact that you kind of would deny the food processes and the body mechanics that all interplay before the stomach rumbles, right? Where the stomach rumbles is kind of like the late expression of you lacking food, right? Because the moment that you basically engage in any type of energy consuming movement, you're already engaging with a kind of uh, lack. But what I'm trying to say is to situate where that lack actually is kind of impossible. And Derrida gives a good example about why referring to the origin is kind of impossible. And this is why I'm playing off of this example when I say the origin of lack, because in order to refer to the origin of lack, you ironically, and this is Derrida's critique of the origin in general, you ironically have to use a present discourse to refer back to the origin. And the moment that you refer back to the origin, you eclipse that origin. Hi, Sam. Hope you're doing good. I'm just talking about I'm kind of challenging the notion of lack and it's yeah, I'm kind of challenging the notion of lack and how do we know where lack is located, right? How do we know where lack is located? Because a lot of the conversation around lack is like this kind of given where it's like I'm born, I'm lacking, I have to eat food, I have to have sex, But then when we start talking about the origin of that lack, what I'm going to try to reveal here is that it gets more and more obfuscated about where that lack actually is, right? And the example that I was giving was hunger, right? So you understand when your belly rumbles, you're lacking food, so that's an indication to eat, right? I think most people would stop there, right? But the problem is when you really start thinking about the body mechanics of what led you to become hungry, it becomes really more difficult to situate where that lack originates. So, for example, the very fact that I'm full and any movement that I do sort of consumes energy um, is also part of the process of how lack starts to occur, right? But to say like lack originates the moment I move my body is also uh, kind of it kind of obfuscates the origin too. And so somebody could say like, okay, well, the origin of lack is the moment birth happens, right? The moment birth happens. Um, but then it gets tricky because then you have to talk about that regressive loop of like your parents and so on. So if you really want to go back to the origin of lack, right? Say like the moment of your conception, well, basically you would undo your very self in the moment of trying to refer back to that lack. And that's what Derrida is trying to say in all of this is that you would completely undo the subject by referring back to the origin. And so what I'm trying to say is even though we keep saying that there's a lack, um, it it becomes increasingly problematic because we don't know where that lack actually is because we can't refer back to it. Now, Derrida, through Judith Butler's introduction of grammatology, she says something like, we might not be able to refer back to the origin, but we can institute it. And I'm still struggling with, uh, I guess from what I understand is like you can kind of get like a conceptual understanding of like that origin. Um, and and so like I've been saying, it's the origin of lack is what is ironically problematic when we talk about lack in and of itself. Because you have to use a discourse, a language to refer back to that origin of lack. But the moment that you use a discourse to refer to the origin of that lack, you ironically eclipse the origin of that lack. You cover over it because you're using a discourse to say that, right? Um, and I think that's like what's really problematic about talking about the origin of lack and where lack itself is actually situated. Um, and I think this does raise like a really interesting problem when we talk about lack in and of itself, because even though we have instances where it's like I have this urge, this desire for eating, sex, and everything else, it infinitely becomes questionable as to where that lack is actually located. And where that lack is actually located is something, in my opinion, like Derrida would say, it's impossible to refer back to. So instead, you have something called what Derrida calls is a trace, and it would basically be lack, right? And then a cross, like a sort of line, would go through that lack. It would be a crossed out lack, but it still needs to be there. So there's this way that lack is. It cannot be referred to. It cannot be referred back to as like a kind of like origin of something. Um, and if I were to like give like another example of how it's almost like impossible to refer back to the origin, it's kind of like how people talk about like um, they talk about if I could go back in the past, I would do so and so, right? I would do such thing and everything else, right? But the thing is, once you go back in the past, that very thing that you're talking about doesn't actually exist because of that, because the logic that you're using is from the present and you're trying to go back to the past to justify some type of action that you want to do in the past. But the thing is that the moment that you try to do that, you obfuscate that very origin. And so one example that I like to give is like, let's say you have beef with your parents. You're like, okay, you know what? I'm gonna prevent. Like let's say the kid goes, I hate my dad so much. I wish, I just wish he didn't exist, right? So he goes back and he tries to like annihilate him in the past, right? He tries to like take him on when he's like a kid or something. But the thing is, the moment that he does that, he annihilates his own subjectivity. The kid that goes back in time, he annihilates his own subjectivity because he basically erases the very thing that allowed him to exist in the first place. Um, so it's kind of fascinating thinking about this problem of like when we talk about lack in a very ambiguous manner, um like how like it's weird is like we talk about it in such a way that the origin is the lack or something like that, right? But you can't refer to the origin as a lack because you're already using a present discourse to refer back to the origin, which already conceals over that origin. So then actually you can't really refer back to it and claim that the origin itself was a lack because you're sort of using a present discourse to refer back to that origin. And so this is like the problematic element in all of this. Uh, and I also think it's just as problematic when we talk about, for example, like the desire to have sex. Where's that lack located? Um, and I know I'm almost like advocating a very like Buddhist type of thing where it's like when people keep talking about a self, it's like, okay, well, where's the self actually located then? Right? Where's the self located in any manner? Like, where is it actually located? Like in your body? And you can't like refer to it in a way. And it's the same thing with lack, where it's like, okay, so what part of lack is constituted in you that you can point to say that you lack, right? And so it becomes this like really funny negation of negation that kind of happens where it's like in the moment of you trying to discover where the lack originates, you negate the lack. um, and that ironically might be what it means to actually confront your lack, is discovering that the very origination of that lack is impossible to refer to, you know, quotations lack, which then you realize that itself uh, is not a lack because you have to situate it and locate it somewhere. Now, of course, my own assertions are probably a lot of really problematic for a lot of people. But what's funny is like I enjoy playing with this concept because it it's such an interesting way to think about it. Like if someone were to say I love like I love that person and I need that person, and I say, okay, show me where you need that person. Like, show me like where that is. Like, show me where that actually exists in yourself. And obviously, I think a person would really struggle with that kind of saying, because even if they were to point to like their heart, like, oh, I feel it in my heart that I need this person, right? Obviously, they can't refer to the physical parts of themselves to say where that is. And they can't even locate where that is. They just know that they're lacking. But what I'm trying to say is that it becomes a problem of origin. But I think what's kind of weird about this ironic like facing lack, and like I'm almost like I feel like I'm really playing with the idea of like, okay, so facing lack would be to realize like when in the midst of you trying to pursue the origins of that lack, you discover that it isn't. Like, so facing lack, and then therefore the excess in itself was always present, which is why you cannot locate the lack in and of itself. And this is why it's impossible to refer to the origin of that lack, because it's an excess. The origin is an excess of itself, which is, again, why you can't refer back to the origin of lack, because fundamentally we're dealing with an excess. And if that's what we mean by facing lack, then I would agree. So that means facing lack would be encountering the very excess itself. But yeah, it's so like it's such a problematic thing, because um we can talk about how you know lack and excess kind of interchange with each other, like Alex Ebert does. He always talks about like saturation and so on. But I do have this example of like, does a mirror lack, right? Does a mirror in itself actually lack? And so if we reduce the mirror to its functionality of mirroring, right? Mirroring. Um, if a mirror has dust on it, does it mean that it's sort of lacking reflection? Um, I think, of course, immediately we would say yes, right? It's lacking reflection. However, the very functionality of the mirror is sort of always present, because once you wipe the mirror clean, it was sort of like always there. So I feel like I am doing this kind of inversion with lack, where basically I do this thing where the mystics do this funny thing too, where it actually Ibn Arabi said this, where the very concealing, like the very curtain of concealing, is actually the revealing. Like it's actually the revealing itself. And so there's actually nothing behind the curtain, because the curtain itself is the revealing. And that's kind of similar to something that I'm saying with lack, where it's like we feel like lack is this curtain that it obfuscates the object for us because we want to get to it. But then, in my opinion, that very curtain, and this would kind of go with the mystical sayings of Ibn Arabi, that very curtain is actually the revealing. It's actually the revealing itself. So nothing is actually obfuscated in this case. But it's kind of funny because we keep talking about like, okay, you need to face your lack. And I think that's something ironic, because it's like the moment you face your lack, you realize that it's not a lack, so to speak. And this goes back to like the origin that I keep talking about. Like, it's very hard for us to locate the origin of lack itself, you know, when we try to refer back to it. But just like Derrida says, in order to refer back to the origin, you have to use a present discourse in which the origin did not come with, and make sense of that origin. But the moment that you do that, you cover over the origin. You do like an eraser kind of a movement. So, locating the lack in the body is kind of like a funny thing to think about. Like, where is the lack of my hunger actually situated? Where is the lack of my sex situated? Where is the lack of anything situated within my own self to point to? And the problem is that you can't point to it, because the moment that you point to it, you go, wait a second, well, doesn't isn't the stomach also connected to the heart? And then isn't also the lungs connected too? And then you realize that the stomach is just one part of the process within that process of the heart and the lungs all functioning properly and everything else. So like, where is that lack actually situated in, for us to point to and say that you are lacking something? So, uh, and, and yeah, so that's the gist of my um, argument in this. And then also there's another saying that I really love, and I forget which scientist said this. I want to say it was Einstein, but somebody asked like something like, "Oh, is like how would you feel if time travel was possible?" And the scientist replies and says, "Well, if time travel was possible, then it was always possible." Um, and so it's this funny inversion where it's like, oh, if if you're saying that if you're saying basically this, and this is why I understand most of like when people talk about like preaching for, this is what I understand when people say like, okay, in order to face your lack. So in order to face your lack, you have to face your lack and then you encounter abundance, basically, right? You encounter your lack and then you encounter abundance. But this is very similar to the time travel logic where the moment that time travel is possible, it was always possible. So I'm basically saying the moment that excess becomes accessible, that means it was always there and it was always present. That's what I'm trying to say. And that's why I fundamentally say something like, um, we can't say that lack is first, so to speak, because if you're saying in order to face, you have to face lack to then encounter abundance, then I'm going to say in response, that means abundance was always there. And that means it was that, and so it inverses that whole thing. Um, and so that's why I feel like the reason why it's impossible to refer back to the origin of lack is because that in itself is an excess, right? And to locate where the lack is to fall into a particularization of where the lack is situated. And but my problem is that I'm not sure if we really think about the origin of lack, because we just talk about like, okay, I lack, I'm hungry, so I lack, I have a desire for sex, so I lack, and all these things. But when you really ask, like, where is that inside of you? Um, where is that really like located at? Can you refer back to it in a real concrete way? And it's kind of impossible to do that. Uh, like I said before, like you can't just say it's the stomach that originates the lack of hunger, because then that neglects the whole process of the body. And so the origin itself becomes obfuscated the moment you pinpoint where the origin of the lack is, because you're using a present discourse, and this is Derrida's critique. Um, but yeah, hopefully that makes sense. uh, yeah, hopefully that makes sense to everyone with that. Um, yeah, I'm hoping that makes sense, because I've there's always something about the conversation of lack that like I've always had it's always felt too epistemological to me, and that's why I'm more with the notion of ontological lack, because ontological lack doesn't really know where the lack itself is situated. It doesn't actually know what it's lacking, right? So it becomes a question of knowing, like, it doesn't know what it lacks. It just says that it lacks. But then to confront that lack ontologically is to realize that it was um, in excess, a gift. The very like Kierkegaard says, the very capacity to receive is a gift. So I think I'm kind of playing on this funny, ironic way of like facing lack, investigating where that lack is, and once you kind of do that exploration about where that lack is, you kind of go through like an ontological shift of being like, oh yeah, that's kind of funny. Like, how can I lack a human being because it's like not situated inside of me. But then it's like, but like how, and yet we say we need the interaction with other human beings. Um, but there's a way in which you can interpret that as the sort of like excess itself, kind of like flowing, out of us all, so to speak. Filling the world, um, filling it. Um, and so you instead of it's like weird because like instead of like needing another person, so to speak, um, you look at it as a sort of like it's not a need and sort of like a I need you to satisfy what I have, but it becomes like a need that is uh for the sake of its own self, if that makes any sense. Like it's it's a love that it is it's a love that is for itself. It's that you love a person for the sake of loving a person, not because you necessarily need anything from them. And I think if there was anything that I'm trying to express out of all of this, it would be fundamentally that I love because I want to love you, not because I need you to do something in particular. Like, I love for the sake of love itself, not for the sake of you satisfying a need, a lack, and so on. And so I think once you kind of like do that investigation of like where the lack is actually located, I think you come across something similar to that realization of like the only way to do this is do it for the sake of the thing in itself, for the sake of loving itself, for the sake of love itself. I think there's a quote by Rumi where it's like, you don't desire eating bread or something like that. It's like, but you desire of the bread. And I've always loved this comment from Rumi because he basically shows how desire desires itself, basically. Desire desires. Um, and it's and ironically, I mean, I feel like that's a kind of like shaky saying because people would feel like, oh, that's weird because then it sounds like narcissistic in some kind of way. But that I feel like that wouldn't be getting at what I'm trying to say. Uh, it because even narcissism is sort of predicated on like an illusion of like I don't need anyone, so to speak. So it's still predicated on a type of need that is an illusion. Like they deny they they still want a person to satisfy it, but they realize they don't. That person doesn't satisfy it, so they put it on themselves to satisfy it, right? To satisfy their narcissism. Um, but really, the whole point of love, in my opinion, is is loving for the sake of loving, basically, and not trying to go for any exchangist, uh, yeah, any exchangist kind of like ideology of like, okay, well, I gave you something because I'm lacking, and you're supposed to also give me something because I'm lacking. Um, but you see, this is like the paradox that Kierkegaard kind of says, right? Between the receiver and the giver, it's not that the receiver and the giver is sort of better, so to speak. It's the very fact that we can both have the capacity to give and receive. That is the gift. The gift is sort of above the receiver and the giver, and that's kind of like what I'm getting at with like facing your lack. um, but yeah, if anybody has any questions, I'll um, stay around for a little bit longer. But yeah, that's it. I'll give myself like 2 more minutes because I know there's like a gap between the me recording myself and then like the people watching. So I know there's like a little bit of a time gap, but yeah. So I'll just wait like a little bit longer, and then I will. Yeah. Oh, hi, Michelle. I basically am about to end the video, but I was gonna say if you guys have any questions, or Michelle, if you were already watching, if you have any questions, um, I'm kind of like willing to answer any questions because I feel like I kind of went on this big irony of like facing lack, which in my opinion would be like facing or trying to discover the origin of your lack. And then that very moment of exploration is that you find this impossible part where it's like you can't really locate the origin of your lack. And so it does this negation of negation, um, where you realize it's sort of like an excess. But then my irony is that the excess then was always there. And you've basically had to do a process of realization to realize what was initially a lack as a sort of obfuscation of that lack. But yeah, it's like I really do feel like the biggest irony is the fact that we do have to eat, and we do have like these cravings for like sex and food and other all types of cravings. But like I feel like that's just like a really deep irony. I would say like that's an irony of excess if that was like if I were to really say anything, because I feel like lack that like I feel like that's too neat like to say like, oh, I'm hungry so I lack something. But I feel like to say something really ironic would be to say, "I'm hungry because it's an excess." You know? So I feel like I really like playing on this notion of irony where it's the irony of excess that I desire to eat, and I desire to, uh have sex and so on. It's like it's such an irony of excess that it forces you to participate ontologically in the world, via that excess that sort of arises like yeah, Michelle, I definitely like that notion too, like the irony of excess. And I think now like I'm definitely inspired to write that notion of like, because I do feel like lack is just like too neat in a fashion like the way that we understand it. To me it's like something that's like too obvious, this idea that it's so obvious that's like, yes, I lack and so I eat. But I'm like, no, it's the irony of excess that you eat and you want to enjoy and you want to be satisfied, but you can never be satisfied. And it's that irony of excess in itself that cannot be satisfied because it's already in excess. Like you cannot satisfy an excess because that's contradictory. You cannot satisfy an excess. Um, and that's why you have to constantly return to the act of sex, of eating, of everything else. You cannot satisfy the excess. Um, but what's ironic about that is that if there wasn't an excess, you it wouldn't like you like if you could be satisfied. Like how can I put it this way? If it was such a neat lack, in my opinion, then you would be able to eat something and then you would never need to be hungry again, in my opinion. You would never need to be hungry again. Um, and if it was a real lack, then having sex, you should have sex once, and then that would be it. Like it would never be. But even though psychoanalysis sort of prides itself on the paradox of desire, I feel like I feel like because of what psychoanalysis has done, it actually led me to this position. It led me to the position of the fact that it's like, oh yeah, it's it's the irony of excess because you cannot satisfy an excess. Why? Because it's an excess, and that's like the deepest irony of all living. Um, but yeah, that yeah, I do enjoy that concept now. I think I want to use that now. The irony of excess. Um, uh, but yeah, I don't know if you have like any specific questions, Michelle, but or any like rebuttals that you can think of. But um, yeah, this is because I feel like it has to be in excess because of the return, if that makes any sense. And this is going to get very theological because God always talks about the return, right? That there's this understanding of the return. Um, but I think the mistake that we make with the concept of the return, and I think this is where Derrida kind of helps us, is that people typically think like so the return is kind of like paradise, so to speak, heaven. People tend to think like, oh, returning is like going back to that pre-fall. Um, and that will be like heaven, like we will return back and we will, be where Adam and Eve was and so on. I think some people kind of like think that in some way, but actually to return would be to return, and I guess this is the part where I get very Nietzschean a little bit, where the return sort of has to be different. And so to return would be like heaven on earth, uh, heaven on, Jerusalem, basically, heaven on earth, Jerusalem, that the very building of Jerusalem. And instead of trying to um, go to heaven. And it's funny because heaven is typically associated as an excess, right? Heaven will, you will go up there and you will have no needs. Basically, all your needs will be satisfied. Everything will be there. But what's ironic about how people look at like you'll never go hungry again, right? Kind of thing. Like that's how heaven is sort of depicted as like a kind of excess. And what's ironic about this is that there's that Jewish saying where it's like, um, as above, so below, right? So the basically there's this parallel where it's like the above also replicates the below kind of thing. Um, and and I think that's like where the deepest irony is. It's like that earth also has its heaven, has its excess, but it's kind of like our human duty to be the co-creators of with God to basically provide that excess, to make a heaven on earth, and attempt to construct that. I would say it's more about not necessarily constructing it, but the striving to do so, the striving to construct that. Um, and that's kind of like where I would situate myself, even somewhat like theologically, the stress of being co-creators with God, as Iqbal would say, and I still think this is also very Nietzschean too. Um, and so I think it's yeah, I think it's kind of funny, me kind of like inverting this whole process, because I love inverting the logic. Like Derrida says, like the only way to inhabit the system is to kind of like invert it and play with it in that way. And then what's ironic about that is you find an opening, by inhabiting the very logic. So I'm basically doing the same thing where like I'm trying to inhabit the logic of lack, but it really becomes um, this ironic excess, and of course, excess cannot be satisfied, because it is excess. Which I feel like that's going to be my favorite line now. Like, excess cannot be satisfied because it's excess. uh, which causes you, ironically, to return, to return, to eating, to having sex, to all this stuff. Quick note on excess and appetites. The only thing that can keep a sex drive or any drive going is an excess. I think of the excess of water propelling a wheel, the turning of wheel represent drive. Yeah, that's a really good. Um, that's a really good. That's a really good example, actually. I think that's actually way better than my vase example of like, oh, there's water spilling over, and so you perceive it as a kind of lack, like water spilling out of you, kind of thing. But I think the wheel, yeah, the it's so funny because it's like when you play with excess, you you ironically like create things. Um, for example, like the way people kind of build barriers like around like waters and stuff, like you have to kind of like manipulate the excess to then like make an overflow of water come out and give it to the people, or like all this other stuff. And Buber even talks about how creating is is kind of an excess, because you have to you have all these possibilities, you have literally all these possibilities, but you don't know what to do with these possibilities. So fundamentally you have to make a choice, and make a choice means sacrificing all that excess of possibilities and picking one, and then using and then putting it into the world. And it's kind of like, yeah, I can definitely see like the irony of like the fact that we're always presented with all these possibilities in a way, and fundamentally to make a choice is really, I think, maybe even the constitution of lack, where it's like you have to strip down the excess, make a choice, and put that out in the world, like your very action. So it's possible that lack itself is situated in the choice, um and not in the the um the hypotheticals of where the origin is. That's actually a really good that's a really good thought there that you sparked there, Michelle. That it's starting to make me think that the choice is the very institution of lack, so to speak. because an individual has to cut. He has to make a cut within all the choices and attitudes of his life, and choose somewhere to begin. Right? He has to choose where he wants to begin. Even though he's already begun, he has to really choose where he begins. And that is a person taking responsibility, cutting all the excess, and the very lack of that excess is constituted in the choice, that he makes. Um, yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. The choice is what constitutes the lack. Uh, yeah, I like that. Michelle's like, yes, 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 yes. uh, I've never really thought about that, but actually, Boober actually really gives a kind of good example of how, how even when you have to create something, you have to reduce, you have to make a reduction in all the possibilities. Um, yeah, that is really good, actually. But anyways, I gotta go. I gotta do my own work. Do my own work. And I'm here just like, oh, I'd rather talk about excess and the irony of excess. Um, bye, Felicia. Yeah. Yes, go read. Okay. All right, guys. Take care. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your good examples, Michelle. They were good. All right. Bye, guys.